The courtroom fell dead silent. Every person in the packed room stopped breathing as they watched a tiny 7-year-old girl with cornrow braids walk up to Judge Margaret Sullivan's bench. Her worn sneakers squeaked against the polished marble floor, and her faded yellow dress hung loose on her small frame. Judge Sullivan sat rigid in her wheelchair behind the imposing wooden desk, her pale hands gripping the armrests that had imprisoned her for 3 long years. In 25 years presiding over Birmingham's most difficult cases, she had never seen a child this young approach her bench during such a serious trial. Hope Thompson looked up at the judge with bright brown eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. She pressed her small, dark hands against the mahogany bench and spoke in a voice so clear it carried to every corner of the silent courtroom. "Your Honor," the child said, "if you let my daddy go free, I promise I'll heal your legs." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 weeks earlier, Elijah Thompson had been a man clinging to the last threads of hope in Birmingham's South Side neighborhood. At 38, his weathered hands bore the calluses of a dozen different jobs, each one lost to circumstances beyond his control. The prosthetic leg beneath his worn jeans was a constant reminder of the IED that had shattered more than just bone and muscle in Afghanistan's dusty hills. The cramped apartment on 15th Avenue South told the story of their struggles without words. Peeling paint curled from walls that had seen better decades, and the ancient radiator coughed like an old man with pneumonia. But in the corner by the window sat Hope's carefully arranged collection of library books, stacked with the precision of a 7-year-old who understood that knowledge was treasure. Hope Thompson was not like other children. While her classmates played games on tablets, she studied faces, reading emotions like others read picture books. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had called her unnaturally perceptive after Hope correctly identified which children came from troubled homes just by watching them during lunch. The gift manifested in small ways, comforting crying babies with a touch, knowing exactly what to say to ease an elderly person's loneliness, somehow making hurt feelings disappear with her gentle presence. Judge Margaret Sullivan ruled her courtroom from behind 30 years of legal precedent and 3 years of personal bitterness. The car accident that had stolen her ability to walk had also hardened something essential inside her soul. She dispensed justice with mechanical precision, her decisions sharp as winter wind cutting through Alabama's autumn air. The framed photograph on her desk sat face down, too painful to look at, containing memories of choices that haunted her dreams. District Attorney William Harrison commanded respect through fear rather than admiration. His conviction rate was legendary, his methods sometimes questionable, his personal demons carefully hidden behind expensive suits and political ambitions. Colleagues whispered about his drinking, about the tremor in his hands when certain cases crossed his desk, about the way he avoided eye contact with Judge Sullivan during proceedings. The threads of their lives had been weaving together for months without any of them realizing it. Eli's disability checks barely covered rent, leaving Hope's medical needs perpetually unmet. Her asthma had worsened with Birmingham's humid autumn air, and the inhaler that could save her life cost more than Eli earned in a week of janitorial work at the courthouse. Judge Sullivan's physical therapy sessions had stalled, her doctor's optimism replaced by gentle suggestions about accepting permanent limitations. She had stopped believing in second chances, in miracles, in anything beyond the cold comfort of legal statutes. Harrison's secret gnawed at him like cancer, the weight of unconfessed guilt driving him to prosecute with increasing severity, as if sending others to prison could somehow atone for his own unpunished crimes. None of them knew that within 3 weeks, a desperate father's love would collide with a child's impossible promise. forcing them all to confront the difference between justice and mercy, between healing and revenge. The evening air hung thick with humidity as Elijah Thompson climbed the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment, his prosthetic leg making each step a deliberate effort. The courthouse cleaning shift had ended at 6, but he'd stayed an extra hour scrubbing floors, hoping the supervisor might notice his dedication. Every additional dollar mattered when your daughter's next breath depended on a plastic inhaler that cost more than most people spent on dinner. Hope was curled on their second-hand couch when he entered, her small chest rising and falling with the telltale wheeze that had become the soundtrack of their lives. The autumn humidity always made it worse, turning Birmingham's Indian summer into a seasonal prison for children whose lungs struggled against the weight of thick air. "How you feeling, baby girl?" Eli asked, settling beside her with a grunt as his leg protested the day's labor. "It's getting harder, Daddy," Hope whispered, her voice thin as tissue paper. "Mrs.?" "Rodriguez says I sound like her old tea kettle." Eli's heart clenched as he watched his daughter struggle with something as basic as breathing. The inhaler on the coffee table was nearly empty, maybe 2 doses left if they were careful. He'd counted his money 3 times during his lunch break. $12.37. The pharmacy wanted $67 for a new inhaler. "I've been thinking about Mama again," Hope said, her brown eyes meeting his. "Do you think she watches us from heaven?" "Every single day, sweetheart." Eli stroked her braids, remembering Sarah's gentle hands doing the same thing 7 years ago. His wife had died bringing Hope into the world, bleeding out in a delivery room while he held their daughter for the first time. The joy and grief had been so intertwined he'd never fully separated them. As night fell, Hope's breathing became increasingly labored. She sat upright, unable to lie flat, her small hands pressed against her chest as she fought for each breath. Eli paced their tiny living room, watching his daughter suffer while feeling utterly powerless. The medical bills from her last emergency room visit still sat unpaid on the kitchen counter, threatening letters from collection agencies arriving weekly. "Daddy," Hope gasped, I can't catch my breath." Panic shot through Eli's chest like lightning. He grabbed the inhaler, shook it, and heard the dreaded hollow rattle of an empty canister. Hope's lips were beginning to take on a bluish tint that made his blood run cold. "We're going to the pharmacy right now," he said, scooping her into his arms. The walk to Patterson's pharmacy felt like carrying his daughter through quicksand. Hope's weight seemed to increase with each labored breath, and Eli found himself whispering prayers he hadn't spoken since Sarah's funeral. The fluorescent lights of the pharmacy blazed like a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. Inside, families moved through the aisles with casual certainty, purchasing remedies for minor ailments with the confidence of people who'd never had to choose between medicine and rent. Eli approached the pharmacy counter, Hope still in his arms, her breathing now clearly audible to anyone nearby. "I need an emergency inhaler for my daughter," he told the pharmacist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and tired shoulders. "Do you have insurance?" she asked, already knowing the answer from his expression. "No, ma'am, but I have $12 and I can pay the rest Friday when I get paid." The pharmacist's face softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry, hun. Store policy requires full payment up front for prescription medications. The inhaler costs $67. Eli felt the world tilting beneath his feet. "Please, look at her. She can't breathe. I understand and I wish I could help. But if I bend the rules for one person..." She gestured helplessly at the cameras mounted in every corner. Hope stirred in his arms, her voice barely a whisper. "It's okay, Daddy. We'll figure something out." But Eli saw the fear in his daughter's eyes, felt the irregular rhythm of her struggling chest against his own. In that moment, watching his child suffer, while a shelf full of medicine sat just yards away, something inside him broke. Not dramatically, not with anger or violence, but with the quiet desperation of a father who'd run out of options. He set Hope down gently in a chair near the pharmacy counter. "Wait here for Daddy, okay? I'll be right back." Walking through the store's aisles, Eli's hands shook as he picked up the inhaler they needed. $67 of plastic and medication that could save his daughter's life. Behind him, Hope's labored breathing served as a countdown timer to disaster. The security cameras tracked his movements as he slipped the inhaler into his jacket pocket. 25 years of following every rule, of believing the system would provide for those who worked hard and did right, dissolved in the face of his daughter's desperate need for her next breath. The Birmingham courthouse buzzed with an energy that seemed to crackle through its marble corridors 3 weeks later. Word had spread through the community about the case of Elijah Thompson, the disabled veteran who'd stolen medicine for his dying daughter. Local news crews set up cameras outside, and the gallery filled with an unusual mix of supporters and skeptics, creating a tension that bailiffs hadn't seen in years. Judge Margaret Sullivan wheeled herself into the courtroom with her usual mechanical precision, but something felt different this morning. Perhaps it was the packed gallery, or the way conversations hushed when she entered, or the strange energy that seemed to pulse through the room like a living thing. She positioned her wheelchair behind the bench, her pale hands gripping the armrests as she surveyed the crowd. District Attorney William Harrison sat at the prosecution table, his expensive suit impeccably pressed, but his hands betraying a slight tremor as he shuffled through his papers. He'd built his career on cases like this one, clear-cut crimes with sympathetic defendants that allowed him to demonstrate that the law applied equally to everyone, regardless of circumstances. But something about this case made his stomach churn in ways he couldn't quite name. At the defense table sat Sarah Running Bear, the overworked public defender who'd drawn Elijah's case. Her weathered briefcase contained more hope than legal precedent, and she knew it. In 15 years of defending Birmingham's forgotten citizens, she'd learned to fight battles she couldn't win with weapons the system barely allowed her to wield. Elijah Thompson entered the courtroom wearing a borrowed suit that hung loose on his frame, his prosthetic leg creating a subtle rhythm against the marble floor. His eyes searched the gallery until they found Mrs. Rodriguez, their elderly neighbor who'd promised to bring hope when the time came. The empty seat beside her made his chest tighten with worry. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Margaret Sullivan," the bailiff announced, though everyone could see that the judge herself remained seated in her wheelchair. Judge Sullivan's voice carried the weight of decades when she spoke. "Be seated. We're here today for the case of the state of Alabama versus Elijah Thompson, charged with theft in the second degree." She paused, looking out at the packed courtroom. "Before we begin, I want to address the unusual public interest in this case. Justice is not a spectator sport, and I will not tolerate any disruptions." Harrison rose with practiced confidence, his opening statement polished smooth by years of similar cases. "Your Honor, the facts are simple and undisputed." On the evening of October 15th, the defendant entered Patterson's pharmacy and stole prescription medication valued at $67. Security footage clearly shows Mr. Thompson concealing the inhaler in his jacket and attempting to leave without payment. He gestured toward the evidence table where the inhaler sat in a plastic bag, marked and cataloged like any other piece of stolen property. The state sympathizes with Mr. Thompson's situation. We all understand that watching a child suffer is heartbreaking. But the law cannot bend to every sad story, no matter how compelling. If we allow theft when the circumstances tug at our heartstrings, where do we draw the line? Harrison's voice gained strength as he continued, though his hands remained unsteady. The pharmacy Mr. Thompson robbed is a small business owned by the Patterson family for 3 generations. They employ 12 people from this community. When people steal from them, They don't just hurt a faceless corporation, they threaten the livelihoods of their neighbors. Sarah Running Bear stood slowly, her movements carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd spent too many nights preparing impossible defenses. Your Honor, my client doesn't dispute what happened that night. Eli Thompson took an inhaler from Patterson's pharmacy without paying for it. But sometimes, the law must consider not just what happened, but why it happened. She walked toward the jury box, empty in this bench trial, but her words were directed at Judge Sullivan. Eli Thompson served 2 tours in Afghanistan, where he lost his leg defending our freedom. He came home to a country that thanked him for his service but couldn't provide him with the health care his daughter needed to breathe. Sarah's voice cracked slightly as she continued. Hope Thompson wasn't dying of some rare disease that required experimental treatment. She was dying of asthma, a condition that kills children in America every day, not because we lack the medicine to treat it, but because their families lack the money to buy it. The courtroom stirred as she spoke, murmurs rippling through the gallery like wind through wheat. My client worked 60 hours a week cleaning the very building where we sit today, earning barely enough to keep a roof over their heads. When faced with watching his daughter suffocate or breaking a law that values property over human life, he chose love over law. Judge Sullivan's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in her eyes as she watched the defense attorney's passionate plea. She'd heard similar arguments hundreds of times before, but today they seemed to penetrate deeper than usual. Harrison objected before Sarah could continue. Your Honor, the defense is asking you to ignore the law based on an emotional appeal. Mr. Thompson had options. He could have taken his daughter to the emergency room, he could have contacted social services or charitable organizations, and watched her suffocate while waiting for bureaucratic wheels to turn, Sarah shot back, her professional composure cracking. How long should a parent watch their child struggle to breathe before they're allowed to act? The courtroom doors opened with a soft creak, and every head turned to see Mrs. Rodriguez entering with a small figure beside her. Hope Thompson walked slowly down the aisle, her bright yellow dress a splash of sunshine in the formal darkness of the courtroom. Her breathing was audible even from the back row, each inhale a conscious effort that reminded everyone present what this case was really about. Judge Sullivan felt her breath catch as she watched the child approach. There was something about Hope's presence that seemed to change the very air in the room, as if her struggle to breathe had reminded everyone else how precious each breath truly was. Hope Thompson's small hand slipped from Mrs. Rodriguez's weathered fingers as she walked toward her father with determined steps. The courtroom held its collective breath, watching this tiny figure navigate between rows of wooden benches filled with strangers who had come to witness her family's pain. Her yellow dress caught the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows, creating an almost ethereal glow around her small frame. Elijah's eyes filled with tears as his daughter approached. He had specifically asked Mrs. Rodriguez to keep Hope away from the trial, not wanting her to see him sitting at the defendant's table like a common criminal. But looking at her now, he realized she belonged here more than anyone else. This entire nightmare had begun with her struggle to breathe, and perhaps it was fitting that she should see how it ended. "Daddy," Hope whispered as she reached him, her voice carrying clearly in the silent courtroom. "I've been praying for you every night." Judge Sullivan found herself leaning forward in her wheelchair, straining to hear the child's soft words. There was something about Hope's presence that seemed to shift the entire atmosphere of the proceedings. The harsh, fluorescent lights seemed softer, the sterile marble walls less cold, the weight of legal protocol somehow lighter. Sarah Running Bear knelt beside Hope, her professional demeanor softening. "Sweetheart, this is a very serious grown-up meeting. Your daddy and I are trying to help the judge understand why he had to take your medicine." Hope nodded solemnly, her wise brown eyes taking in the formal surroundings with the careful attention of a child who understood that important things were happening around her. "Mrs. Sarah, the judge lady looks very sad. Her hurt color is darker than anyone I've ever seen." The courtroom stirred at the child's unusual observation. Several people in the gallery leaned forward, intrigued by her innocent comment about colors and hurt. Judge Sullivan felt an unexpected chill run down her spine at Hope's words, though she couldn't explain why. District Attorney Harrison stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made Hope flinch. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Children don't belong in courtroom proceedings, especially as emotional manipulation tactics." His words sparked immediate outrage from the gallery. Voices rose in protest, with several people calling out their disagreement. The bailiff moved to restore order, but Judge Sullivan raised her hand for silence. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice carrying a warning edge, "I'll determine what belongs in my courtroom. The child may stay, but she will remain quiet during the proceedings." Hope looked up at the judge with those penetrating brown eyes and smiled. It was a smile that seemed to carry more warmth and understanding than should have been possible from someone so young. "Thank you, Judge Lady. I promise to be good." Judge Sullivan felt something tighten in her chest at the child's simple gratitude. She had been addressed as Your Honor or Judge Sullivan thousands of times throughout her career, but no one had ever called her Judge Lady with such innocent respect. The title somehow felt more genuine than all the formal courtesies she had received over the decades. As the trial resumed, Hope settled quietly beside her father, her small hand resting on his arm in a gesture of comfort that didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the courtroom. Her presence seemed to ground Elijah, giving him strength to face the proceedings with dignity rather than desperation. Sarah Running Bear called her first witness, Dr. Patricia Williams from Children's Hospital. The elderly physician took the stand with the authority of someone who had spent 40 years treating Birmingham's sickest children. "Dr. Williams," Sarah began, "in your professional opinion, how serious was Hope Thompson's condition on the night in question?" Dr. Williams glanced at Hope, her expression softening. "Severe acute asthma can be fatal within minutes if left untreated. Based on the emergency room records from that night, Hope was in respiratory distress that could have resulted in death without immediate intervention." Harrison objected. "Your Honor, the severity of the child's condition doesn't justify theft. There were legal alternatives available." "Such as?" Sarah challenged. Harrison consulted his notes. "Emergency room treatment is required by law regardless of ability to pay. Mr. Thompson could have taken his daughter to the hospital." Dr. Williams shook her head sadly. "Counselor, have you ever watched a child suffocate?" Every second counts during an asthma attack. The time it would have taken to drive across town to the hospital could have been the difference between life and death. The courtroom fell silent as the weight of her words settled over everyone present. Hope's soft wheezing served as a constant reminder of the fragility of her condition, making the doctor's testimony feel immediate and urgent rather than abstract and clinical. Judge Sullivan found herself studying Hope's face as the testimony continued. The child seemed remarkably calm for someone whose life and father's freedom hung in the balance. She sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, occasionally reaching over to pat her father's arm when his emotions threatened to overwhelm him. Sarah called several more witnesses. Hope's teacher, who testified about her frequent absences due to breathing problems, their landlord, who confirmed Elijah's work ethic and character, and Mrs. Rodriguez, who described watching Hope struggle through countless attacks while her father worked multiple jobs to pay for medicine they couldn't afford. Each testimony painted a picture of a family trapped by circumstances beyond their control. But Harrison's cross-examinations remained sharp and focused on one central point: regardless of the circumstances. Theft was theft, and the law could not bend for every heartbreaking situation. During a brief recess, Hope approached Judge Sullivan's bench while the courtroom buzzed with conversation. The bailiff moved to intercept her, but the judge held up her hand. "It's all right, Officer Martinez. Let her approach." Hope stood on her tiptoes to see over the high bench, her small hands pressed against the polished wood. "Judge Lady, may I ask you something?" Judge Sullivan found herself leaning down to hear the child better. "What is it, sweetheart? Why do you sit in that rolling chair instead of standing up like the other grown-ups?" The question was asked with such innocent curiosity that Judge Sullivan felt her defensive walls crumble slightly. In 3 years since her accident, no one had asked about her wheelchair with such simple directness. "I was hurt in a car accident," she explained quietly. "My legs don't work the same way anymore." Hope nodded seriously, as if this explanation made perfect sense. "That must make you very sad. When I can't breathe right, it makes me sad too. But Daddy says being sad about something doesn't mean we have to stay sad forever." Judge Sullivan felt an unexpected tightness in her throat. "Your daddy sounds very wise." "He is," Hope said with complete confidence. "And he's good too. He only took my medicine because he loves me more than he's scared of getting in trouble." "Isn't that what daddies are supposed to do?" Before Judge Sullivan could respond, the bailiff called the court back to order. Hope returned to her seat beside Elijah, but the judge found her thoughts lingering on the child's simple question. Isn't that what parents are supposed to do? Put their children's needs above everything else, including their own safety. As Harrison began his closing argument, Judge Sullivan watched Hope's face, rather than listening to his familiar recitation of legal precedents and slippery slope arguments. The child seemed to be studying the prosecutor with the same intense focus she had shown the judge, her head tilted slightly as if she were listening to something beyond his words. "Your Honor," Harrison concluded, "sympathy cannot be allowed to override justice. If we excuse theft when the motives are pure, we open the door to chaos. The law must apply equally to everyone, regardless of their circumstances or our feelings about their situations." Sarah Running Bear's closing was brief but powerful. "Your Honor, my client stands before you not as a criminal, but as a father who faced an impossible choice. When the system failed his family, when bureaucracy threatened his daughter's life, he chose love over law. I'm not asking you to excuse his actions. I'm asking you to understand them and to consider whether justice is best served by punishing a man whose only crime was loving his child too much." As Sarah sat down, the courtroom fell into expectant silence. Judge Sullivan looked out at the faces before her, some hopeful, some skeptical, all waiting for her decision. Her eyes found Hope, who was watching her with that same penetrating gaze that seemed to see straight through to her soul. The judge took a deep breath, preparing to render a verdict that would affect not just Elijah Thompson's future, but potentially set a precedent for how the justice system balanced law with mercy. The words formed in her mind, a careful legal ruling that would satisfy the requirements of her position while acknowledging the complexity of the situation. But then Hope stood up. The 7-year-old walked away from her father, past the bar that separated the gallery from the court, and approached the bench with the confidence of someone much older. The bailiff moved to stop her, but Judge Sullivan found herself saying, "Let her come." Hope stopped directly in front of the bench and looked up at the judge with those remarkable brown eyes. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the silent courtroom, reaching every person present with crystal clarity. "Judge Lady," she said, her small hands pressed against the wooden barrier between them, "if you let my daddy go free, I promise I'll heal your legs." The courtroom erupted into absolute chaos. Gasps echoed off the marble walls as people shot to their feet, some laughing in disbelief, others shouting protests, and a few wiping away tears at the child's innocent declaration. The bailiff stepped forward, unsure how to handle a situation that existed nowhere in courthouse protocol. Order! Judge Sullivan banged her gavel repeatedly, but the sound was nearly drowned out by the cacophony of voices. Order in my courtroom! District Attorney Harrison jumped to his feet, his face flushed with indignation. Your Honor, this is preposterous. We cannot allow a child to make impossible promises to influence a criminal proceeding. This is emotional manipulation of the highest order. Sarah Running Bear stood as well, her voice cutting through the noise. Your Honor, my client had no knowledge his daughter would make such a statement. This was entirely spontaneous. But Judge Sullivan couldn't take her eyes off Hope Thompson. The 7-year-old stood perfectly still amid the chaos, her small hands still pressed against the bench, her brown eyes fixed on the judge with unwavering certainty. There was no fear in her expression, no hesitation, only the quiet confidence of someone who believed absolutely in what she had just promised. Silence! Judge Sullivan's voice carried the authority of decades on the bench. The courtroom gradually quieted, though the tension remained thick as storm clouds. Everyone will be seated immediately, or I will clear this courtroom. As order slowly returned, Hope remained standing at the bench. Judge Sullivan leaned forward in her wheelchair, studying the child's face with an intensity that made everyone present hold their breath. Young lady, the judge said quietly, do you understand what you just said? Hope nodded solemnly. Yes, ma'am. I said I would make your legs work again if you let my daddy come home with me. And do you believe you can actually do such a thing? Yes, ma'am, Hope replied with the same matter-of-fact tone she might use to confirm her age or address. I can help people feel better when they're hurt inside. Mrs. Rodriguez's back stopped hurting after I visited her. Tommy Patterson's arm healed faster than the doctors thought it would, and Mrs. Williams at the grocery store stopped being so sad after her husband died. Judge Sullivan felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't quite hope. She had abandoned that luxury long ago, but it was something similar, something dangerous. She had built her post-accident life on the foundation of accepted limitations, carefully constructed routines that acknowledged her disability without dwelling on what she had lost. Your Honor, Harrison interrupted, his voice sharp with frustration, surely you're not considering the impossible claims of a 7-year-old child. This is a court of law, not a faith-healing revival. Judge Sullivan's eyes flashed with something that made Harrison take a step back. Mr. Harrison, I will determine what I consider in my courtroom. You will not speak again unless I address you directly. She turned back to Hope, her voice softening slightly. Sweetheart, the doctors have told me that my legs will never work again. Very smart doctors with lots of expensive machines and years of training. What makes you think you can help when they cannot? Hope tilted her head, considering the question with the seriousness of a scholar pondering a complex theorem. Sometimes grown-ups think healing only happens in hospitals with medicine and machines, but I think healing happens when hurt people remember they're loved. Your legs might be sleeping because your heart is too sad to wake them up. The courtroom was so quiet that Hope's soft breathing was audible from the back row. Judge Sullivan felt tears threatening for the first time in months, an emotion she had carefully suppressed since learning to navigate the world from the height of a wheelchair. Elijah Thompson rose slowly from his seat, his prosthetic leg making a soft mechanical sound against the floor. Hope, baby, come back here. You don't need to bother the judge with— No, Judge Sullivan said firmly. Let her speak. She looked down at Hope again. You really believe you can help me walk? I believe love can fix anything that's broken, Hope said with the absolute certainty that only children possess, even things that grown-ups think are too broken to fix. Sarah Running Bear seized the moment. Your Honor, perhaps we could consider an alternative to traditional sentencing. Community service, restitution to the pharmacy, some form of restorative justice that acknowledges both the crime and the extraordinary circumstances. Harrison's face grew redder. Your Honor, you cannot seriously be considering altering a legal proceeding based on a child's fantasy. This sets a dangerous precedent that could undermine the entire justice system. Judge Sullivan sat back in her wheelchair, her mind racing through decades of legal training and 3 years of physical limitations. Everything in her education, her experience, and her medical knowledge told her that Hope's promise was impossible. Paralyzed legs don't suddenly start working because a child believes in miracles. But as she looked at Hope's earnest face, Judge Sullivan remembered something she had forgotten in the years since her accident. She remembered being 8 years old and believing that anything was possible if you wanted it badly enough. She remembered the Christmas morning when she had asked Santa for her father to come home from Vietnam, and how her mother had gently explained that some things were beyond even Santa's power. Yet here stood this child, offering hope with the same innocent certainty that Judge Sullivan had once possessed. The rational part of her mind screamed warnings about false hope and public humiliation, but another part, a part that had been buried under years of legal precedent and medical reality, whispered a dangerous question. What if? Hope, Judge Sullivan said slowly, if I were to consider your offer, what would you need from me? The gallery stirred with murmurs of disbelief and excitement. Harrison looked as if he might suffer a stroke, while Sarah Running Bear gripped her pen so tightly her knuckles had turned white. I would need you to believe that good things can still happen, Hope said simply. And I would need you to let my daddy come home so he can help me take care of you while your legs remember how to work. Judge Sullivan closed her eyes for a long moment, feeling the weight of every decision she had ever made from this bench. She thought about the hundreds of defendants who had stood before her, the families torn apart by crimes both petty and serious, the endless cycle of punishment that seemed to change nothing and heal no one. When she opened her eyes, she looked directly at Hope. Young lady, you have made me a very serious promise. Do you understand that promises should never be broken? Yes, ma'am. Daddy taught me that your word is the most important thing you own. And you truly believe you can help me walk again? I don't just believe it, Hope said with startling conviction. I know it. Sometimes the best healing happens when people stop being afraid to hope. Judge Sullivan took a deep breath that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the silent courtroom. Mr. Thompson, she said, looking at Elijah, you have committed a crime that under normal circumstances would result in jail time and significant fines. However, your daughter has made me an offer that I find intriguing. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as everyone leaned forward to hear her decision. Therefore, I am going to do something I have never done in 25 years on this bench. I am postponing your sentencing for 30 days. If, within that time, your daughter can fulfill her promise to me, all charges against you will be dropped. Harrison shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. You cannot make legal decisions based on the impossible claims of a child. Mr. Harrison, Judge Sullivan replied calmly, in 30 days we will know whether her claims are impossible or not. Until then, Mr. Thompson, you are free to go home with your daughter. The courtroom exploded in cheers and protests as Elijah moved toward Hope, tears streaming down his face. But Judge Sullivan raised her hand for silence one final time. However, she said, and the word hung in the air like a storm cloud, if your daughter cannot fulfill her promise within 30 days, Mr. Thompson, you will return to this courtroom to face not only the original charges, but additional charges for contempt of court and allowing your child to make false representations to a judge. The happiness on Elijah's face dimmed as he realized the full weight of what had just happened. If Hope couldn't heal the judge, he would face even more serious consequences than before. But Hope walked over to her father and took his hand with complete confidence. "Don't worry, Daddy," she said loud enough for the courtroom to hear. Sometimes the most beautiful miracles happen when everything looks impossible. As the bailiff dismissed court, Judge Sullivan remained at her bench, watching father and daughter embrace. For the first time in 3 years, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow, even as her rational mind warned her that she might be setting herself up for the cruelest disappointment of her life. 23 days had passed since Judge Margaret Sullivan made the most unprecedented decision of her judicial career, and Birmingham's autumn air carried whispers of change that seemed to touch everyone who had witnessed that extraordinary courtroom scene. The story had spread far beyond Alabama's borders, drawing national attention and dividing public opinion between those who believed in miracles and those who saw only a grieving judge's moment of weakness. Hope Thompson had become a daily presence in Judge Sullivan's life, visiting the courthouse each afternoon after school with the determination of someone fulfilling a sacred mission. Their meetings had evolved from formal, supervised sessions in the judge's chambers to informal conversations in Lynn Park, where Hope would feed the ducks while the judge watched from her wheelchair, both of them finding peace in the simple rhythm of their shared routine. On this particular morning, Judge Sullivan sat at her kitchen table reviewing case files when her phone rang. Dr. Patricia Williams from Children's Hospital was calling with news that made her blood run cold. "Judge Sullivan, I'm calling about Hope Thompson. She was brought in last night with a severe asthma attack. She's stable now, but we're keeping her for observation. I thought you should know, given your connection with the family." The judge's hands trembled as she hung up the phone. In the weeks since their first meeting, she had grown genuinely fond of the remarkable child who had somehow wormed her way past decades of professional distance and personal walls. The thought of Hope struggling to breathe, fighting for each precious breath, filled her with a panic she hadn't felt since her own accident. She called her driver immediately. "James, I need to get to Children's Hospital." "Now." The pediatric intensive care unit buzzed with the controlled urgency that marked all children's hospitals, but Judge Sullivan's arrival created a stir among the staff who recognized her from the news coverage. She navigated her wheelchair through the corridors with practiced efficiency, following the room numbers until she found Hope's door. Through the glass window, she could see Elijah sitting beside a small bed where Hope lay connected to various monitors and an oxygen mask. The sight of the child's labored breathing brought back memories of that night in the pharmacy, when a desperate father had faced an impossible choice between law and love. Elijah looked up as Judge Sullivan entered, his eyes red with exhaustion and worry. "Judge Sullivan, I didn't expect—" "Thank you for coming." "How is she?" the judge asked, rolling her wheelchair close to the bed. "Touch and go for a while, but the doctors say she's responding well to treatment." The stress of everything, the media attention, people constantly asking her about— He gestured helplessly at Judge Sullivan's wheelchair. "I think it's been too much for her little body to handle." Hope's eyes fluttered open at the sound of familiar voices. Even with the oxygen mask covering half her face, her smile was unmistakable as she saw Judge Sullivan beside her bed. "Judge Lady," she whispered, her voice muffled but audible. "You came to see me?" "Of course I did, sweetheart. How are you feeling?" Hope's small hand emerged from beneath the hospital blanket, reaching toward the judge with fingers that seemed almost translucent in the harsh fluorescent lighting. "I'm sorry I got sick. I know our 30 days are almost up, and I haven't helped your legs yet." Judge Sullivan felt her heart break at the child's words. Here was Hope, fighting for every breath, and she was worried about fulfilling her impossible promise. "Honey, you don't need to worry about that. You just need to focus on getting better." "But I made you a promise," Hope insisted, her breathing labored but her voice determined. "Daddy always says promises are the most important things we own." Dr. Williams entered the room, checking Hope's chart with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades caring for sick children. "Good morning, Judge Sullivan. I'm glad you're here. Hope has been asking about you." "Doctor, will she be all right?" "Children are remarkably resilient, but Hope's asthma has been exacerbated by stress. The excitement of the past few weeks, the media attention, the pressure she's put on herself." Dr. Williams glanced meaningfully at Judge Sullivan. "Sometimes the best medicine for a child is knowing the adults in their life aren't depending on them to solve impossible problems." The words hit Judge Sullivan like a physical blow. In her desperation to believe in something beyond medical limitations, had she placed unfair pressure on a 7-year-old child? Had her willingness to entertain Hope's promise created expectations that were literally making the child sick? That evening, Judge Sullivan sat in her home office staring at the case files that had once defined her entire existence. The 30-day deadline was approaching, and she found herself facing a decision that would affect not only Elijah Thompson's future, but potentially her own credibility as a judge. Her phone rang, startling her from her contemplation. The caller ID showed District Attorney Harrison's number. "Judge Sullivan, I hope you don't mind me calling you at home. I've been following the news about the Thompson child's hospitalization." "What do you want, Bill?" "I want to discuss a plea arrangement." Given the circumstances, the unusual nature of this case, and the child's current condition, perhaps we could find a resolution that serves justice without subjecting a sick little girl to further stress. Judge Sullivan was quiet for a long moment. "What did you have in mind?" "Community service, restitution to the pharmacy, and mandatory counseling. Thompson could avoid jail time, and we could close this chapter without forcing a child to attempt the impossible." After hanging up, Judge Sullivan wheeled herself to the window overlooking her garden. The autumn evening was crisp and clear, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She thought about the past 3 weeks, about the joy she had found in Hope's daily visits, about the way the child's presence had somehow made colors seem brighter and food taste better. For the first time since her accident, Judge Sullivan had awakened each morning with something to look forward to. Not because she believed her legs would miraculously start working, but because Hope's unwavering faith in the possibility of healing had reminded her that life could still hold surprise and wonder. The next morning brought devastating news. Dr. Williams called to report that Hope had suffered another severe attack during the night and was now on a ventilator. The child's condition had deteriorated rapidly, and the medical team was doing everything possible to stabilize her breathing. Judge Sullivan arrived at the hospital to find Elijah in the hallway outside the ICU, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. The sight of this strong man, broken by his daughter's suffering, brought back memories of her own family's anguish after her accident. "Elijah," she said softly, rolling her wheelchair beside his chair. He looked up with eyes that had seen too much pain. "They don't know if she's going to make it through the night. My little girl who wanted to heal the world might not even be able to heal herself." Judge Sullivan reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses from years of hard labor, the trembling of a father facing his worst nightmare. "She's the strongest child I've ever met. If anyone can fight through this, it's Hope." "Judge Sullivan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you really believe Hope can heal your legs? Or were you just being kind to a desperate man and his sick daughter?" The question hung in the air between them like a confession waiting to be made. Judge Sullivan looked through the ICU window at the small figure surrounded by machines, fighting for every breath. "I don't know if she can heal my legs," she said quietly, "but she's already healed something in me that I thought was broken forever. She's reminded me what it feels like to hope, to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. Maybe that's the only miracle any of us really need." As if summoned by their conversation, Dr. Williams appeared with a grave expression that made both adults brace for the worst possible news. "I need to speak with both of you," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decisions that would change everything. "Hope's condition has become critical. We're running out of options, and there's something you both need to understand about what the next few hours might bring." Dr. Williams led them to a small consultation room adjacent to the ICU, her expression grave as she closed the door behind them. The sterile white walls seemed to close in around the three adults as they grappled with the weight of what was about to be revealed. "Hope's condition has stabilized for the moment," Dr. Williams began, "but I need to share something with both of you that changes everything we thought we knew about this case." Judge Sullivan felt her heart skip as she watched the doctor's face, searching for any hint of hope in her professional demeanor. Elijah gripped his chair's armrest so tightly his knuckles had turned white. 3 hours ago, while reviewing Hope's medical history more thoroughly, I discovered something that should have been caught weeks ago. Hope doesn't just have asthma. Dr. Williams paused, choosing her words carefully. She has a rare genetic condition called alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. It affects the lungs and liver, and without proper treatment it's progressive and potentially fatal. The words hit Elijah like physical blows. What does that mean? How long has she had this? Why didn't anyone catch it before? It's often misdiagnosed as simple asthma, especially in children. The symptoms are similar, but the underlying cause is completely different. With proper enzyme replacement therapy, children with this condition can live normal, healthy lives. Without it, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Judge Sullivan felt the room spinning around her. "How much does the treatment cost?" "The enzyme replacement therapy runs approximately $8,000 per month, plus regular monitoring and specialist care. Most insurance plans cover it, but the Thompsons—" Dr. Williams looked at Elijah with compassion. "Without insurance, the annual cost would be over $100,000. Elijah's world crumbled around him. All the sacrifices, all the struggles to afford basic asthma medication, and now this. His daughter needed treatment that cost more than he could earn in 5 years of janitorial work. "How long does she have without treatment?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It's hard to say. Some children deteriorate rapidly, others maintain stable function for years, but without treatment, the condition is ultimately fatal." Judge Sullivan watched Elijah process this devastating news, and something inside her chest tightened with a pain that had nothing to do with her paralyzed legs. This child, who had brought light into her world, who had promised impossible miracles, was facing a battle that no amount of faith or hope could win without proper medical intervention. "There's more," Dr. Williams continued. "While researching Hope's condition, I also discovered something troubling about the events leading to Mr. Thompson's arrest. The pharmacy where he stole the inhaler has been under investigation by the State Medical Board for deliberately overcharging for emergency medications." Elijah looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "The inhaler you took that night typically costs $27 with a standard markup. Patterson's pharmacy was charging $67 for the same medication. They've been targeting low-income families, knowing they have no choice but to pay inflated prices or watch their children suffer." Judge Sullivan felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. "Are you telling me that this entire case, this family's suffering, was caused by price gouging?" "It appears so. The investigation has revealed a pattern of exploitation targeting Birmingham's most vulnerable families. The pharmacy has been reported to state authorities, but the damage to families like the Thompsons has already been done. As they left the consultation room, Judge Sullivan felt the weight of 30 years of judicial decisions pressing down on her shoulders. How many other families had faced impossible choices because of systemic failures and corporate greed? How many other fathers had been criminalized for the desperation born of watching their children suffer? That evening, as Hope remained stable but sedated in the ICU, an unexpected visitor arrived at the hospital. District Attorney William Harrison appeared at the family waiting area, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something that looked suspiciously like remorse. "Judge Sullivan, Mr. Thompson, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I've been following the news about Hope's condition, and there's something I need to tell you both." Elijah looked up with undisguised hostility. "If you're here to gloat about prosecuting a man whose daughter is dying, you can save your breath. Actually, I'm here to confess something that I should have revealed weeks ago." Harrison's voice cracked slightly as he sat down across from them. "The night of Judge Sullivan's car accident 3 years ago, I was the other driver." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through both listeners. Judge Sullivan felt her world tilt on its axis as she stared at the man who had been prosecuting cases in her courtroom for years. "I was driving drunk," Harrison continued, his hands shaking. "I ran the red light at Fifth Avenue and hit your car, Judge Sullivan. I left the scene and reported my car stolen the next morning. The investigation never connected me to the accident." Judge Sullivan's voice was barely audible. "You destroyed my life and then stood in my courtroom for 3 years prosecuting other people for their crimes? Every day I sat in your courtroom was a form of torture. Watching you struggle with the wheelchair, knowing I was responsible, it nearly drove me insane. I started drinking more, prosecuting cases with increasing harshness, as if sending other people to prison could somehow atone for what I'd done to you." Elijah stood abruptly, his face flushed with rage. "You self-righteous bastard! You were ready to send me to prison for stealing medicine while you've been hiding from the consequences of nearly killing a judge?" "You're right," Harrison said quietly. "I'm a hypocrite and a coward. But watching Hope fight for her life made me realize that I can't carry this secret anymore. Some sins are too heavy to bear alone." Judge Sullivan sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation that the man who had stolen her ability to walk had been sitting across from her in court for years, hiding behind prosecutorial immunity while destroying other families. "Why tell us now?" she asked finally. "Because that little girl in there has been preaching about healing and forgiveness, and I realize that true healing can't begin with lies. I'm turning myself in to the State Attorney General's office tomorrow morning. I'll face whatever consequences come from my actions 3 years ago." As Harrison prepared to leave, Judge Sullivan called out to him. "Bill, wait." He turned back, his face etched with years of hidden guilt. Hope was right about one thing. Sometimes healing begins with the truth, no matter how painful it is. The next morning brought news that would change everything once again. Dr. Williams arrived at the hospital with paperwork that she could barely contain her excitement about. "Judge Sullivan, Mr. Thompson, I have extraordinary news. A foundation that provides funding for rare disease treatments has agreed to cover all of Hope's medical expenses, including the enzyme replacement therapy, for the rest of her life." Elijah's legs gave out and he collapsed into a chair. "How is that possible?" "Someone who wishes to remain anonymous has established a fund specifically for Hope's care. The foundation contacted me this morning after reading about her case in the national news. The donor was apparently moved by the story of a child who promised to heal others while fighting her own battle for survival." Judge Sullivan felt tears streaming down her face as the weight of months of worry lifted from her shoulders. "She's going to be okay. With proper treatment, Hope should live a completely normal life." The enzyme replacement therapy will prevent further lung damage, and children who receive early treatment often show remarkable improvement in their overall health and energy levels. As they sat together processing this miraculous turn of events, Hope's eyes fluttered open in the ICU. Her breathing was steady and unlabored for the first time in weeks, and when she saw Judge Sullivan and her father through the glass window, her face lit up with a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire room. "Daddy," she whispered as they were allowed into her room, "I had the most beautiful dream. I dreamed that everyone stopped being angry and started helping each other instead." Judge Sullivan reached out and took Hope's small hand in her own. "Sweetheart, some dreams have a way of coming true when we least expect them." "Judge Lady," Hope said, her voice still weak but determined, "I know our 30 days are almost up, and I'm sorry I couldn't make your legs work yet. But I think maybe I helped heal something else instead." Looking around the room at Elijah's tearful relief, thinking about Harrison's confession and the anonymous donor's generosity, Judge Sullivan realized that Hope had indeed performed a kind of miracle. Not the supernatural healing that everyone had expected, but something perhaps even more powerful: the healing of hearts, the restoration of faith in human goodness, and the reminder that love could indeed triumph over the systems designed to divide and punish. "Hope," Judge Sullivan said softly, "I think you've healed more than you know." 6 months later, the Birmingham courthouse buzzed with an energy that felt entirely different from the tension that had filled its marble corridors during Elijah Thompson's trial. Judge Margaret Sullivan wheeled herself into courtroom 3A, but today she wasn't presiding over criminal proceedings. Instead, she was participating in the dedication ceremony for the courthouse's newest program, the Hope Thompson Restorative Justice Initiative. The gallery was packed with familiar faces from that transformative day in autumn. Elijah Thompson sat in the front row wearing a crisp white shirt and navy tie, his new position as the courthouse's community liaison coordinator having given him not just financial stability, but a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. Beside him sat Hope, now healthy and vibrant, her cheeks pink with the glow that came from proper medical treatment and the absence of constant worry about her next breath. Doctor. Patricia Williams occupied a seat near the front, having become an unofficial advisor to the program that connected families facing medical crises with resources and support systems. Mrs. Rodriguez beamed from her wheelchair in the accessible seating area, her arthritis having improved remarkably since Hope began visiting her twice weekly with stories and gentle companionship. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation belonged to William Harrison, who sat quietly in the back row. His resignation from the district attorney's office had made national headlines, as had his subsequent guilty plea for vehicular assault and leaving the scene of an accident. His sentence of 2 years in minimum security prison and 5 years of community service had been unusual, but Judge Sullivan herself had recommended the restorative approach over purely punitive measures. Harrison now spent his days running addiction recovery programs and speaking to high school students about the consequences of drunk driving. The broken man who had hidden behind prosecutorial power had been replaced by someone who understood the weight of genuine accountability. Sarah Running Bear approached the podium to address the gathered crowd, her role as the program's director having elevated her from overworked public defender to a nationally recognized advocate for criminal justice reform. 6 months ago, she began, a 7-year-old girl stood in this very courtroom and made a promise that seemed impossible to fulfill. She told Judge Sullivan that she could heal her legs if her father was allowed to go free. Today, I want to talk about the miracles that actually occurred in this room. She gestured toward Hope, who was fidgeting with excitement in her seat. Hope Thompson didn't make Judge Sullivan's legs work through supernatural intervention, But she did something far more profound. She reminded us all that healing comes not from punishment, but from understanding, compassion, and addressing the root causes of the problems that bring people before our courts. Judge Sullivan felt a familiar tightness in her throat as Sarah continued. The miracle wasn't physical healing. It was the healing of a justice system that had forgotten its primary purpose isn't to punish, but to restore what has been broken. When Sarah called her to the podium, Judge Sullivan wheeled herself forward with the confidence that had taken months to rebuild. Her physical condition remained unchanged. She still required a wheelchair for mobility, but something fundamental had shifted in how she viewed both her disability and her role as a judge. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "when Hope Thompson promised to heal my legs, I thought she was talking about a medical miracle. What I discovered instead was that I had been confusing physical limitation with spiritual brokenness. My legs may not work the same way they once did, but that doesn't make me broken." She looked directly at Hope, who was listening with the intense focus she brought to everything she considered important. "This remarkable child taught me that healing isn't about returning to what was, but about discovering what can be. She showed me that a person in a wheelchair can still dance, still serve justice, still make a difference in the world." The audience stirred with emotion as Judge Sullivan continued. "The Hope Thompson Restorative Justice Initiative represents a fundamental shift in how our courthouse approaches criminal cases involving families in crisis. Instead of simply punishing desperate acts, we now examine the circumstances that led to those acts and work to address them at their source." Elijah Thompson was called forward to share his perspective as the program's first beneficiary. His voice carried the authority of someone who had experienced both sides of the justice system. "6 months ago, I stood before Judge Sullivan as a criminal," he said. "I had stolen medicine for my dying daughter, and according to the letter of the law, I deserved punishment. But Judge Sullivan and my daughter saw something the law couldn't see, that desperate people do desperate things not because they're bad, but because they're human." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "The program that bears my daughter's name has helped 37 families navigate crises without criminalization. We've connected parents with medical resources, provided emergency assistance for housing and utilities, and most importantly, we've created a bridge between the justice system and the community it serves." Hope was invited to cut the ribbon for the program's new Family Resource Center, a bright space adjacent to the courthouse where families could access social services, legal aid, and crisis intervention before problems escalated to criminal charges. As the 7-year-old wielded the oversized scissors with determination, cameras flashed and the crowd applauded. But the most meaningful moment came afterward, when Hope approached William Harrison during the reception. The former prosecutor looked uncomfortable as the child he had once tried to send to foster care walked up to him with purposeful steps. "Mr. Harrison," Hope said in her clear, confident voice, "Daddy says you've been helping other people learn from their mistakes." Harrison knelt down to her level, his eyes glistening with tears he was trying to suppress. "Yes, Hope. I'm trying to make up for the hurt I caused. Daddy also says that making up for mistakes is how grown-ups learn to be better. I think you're learning real good." The simple words of forgiveness from this child broke something loose in Harrison's chest, and he found himself crying openly for the first time since his confession. Hope, with the instinctive compassion that had started this entire journey, reached out and patted his shoulder. "It's okay, Mr. Harrison. Sad tears are just happiness that got too big for your heart to hold." As the ceremony concluded, Judge Sullivan found herself surrounded by reporters wanting to know about her miracle healing. She had learned to address these questions with patience and clarity. "There was indeed a miracle in my courtroom 6 months ago," she told them. "But it wasn't the supernatural healing of paralyzed legs. It was the healing of a justice system that had forgotten how to see defendants as human beings with stories worth understanding. Later that evening, Judge Sullivan sat in her garden with Hope and Elijah, watching the sunset paint Birmingham's skyline in shades of gold and pink. Hope was reading aloud from one of her library books, her voice strong and clear, without any trace of the wheezing that had once marked every sentence. "Judge Maggie," Hope said, using the informal name she'd adopted for their private moments. "Do you remember when you thought miracles had to be magic?" Judge Sullivan smiled, thinking about how much her understanding of miracles had evolved. "I remember, sweetheart. I thought healing meant making broken things exactly like they were before. But that's not how healing really works," Hope said with the wisdom that continued to amaze the adults in her life. "Healing is when broken things become something new and beautiful, even if they're different from what they used to be." Elijah reached over and squeezed Judge Sullivan's hand, a gesture of friendship that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier when he had stood before her as a defendant facing prison time. "Hope's right," he said. "None of us are the same people we were before this started, but we're all better versions of ourselves." As they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky, Judge Sullivan reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Her legs still didn't work, but she had learned to find joy in rolling through life rather than walking. Hope's lungs still required daily medication, but her spirit soared with the confidence of someone who knew she was deeply loved and supported. The justice system they had all encountered was still imperfect, but it was beginning to bend toward compassion rather than merely punishment. And perhaps most importantly, they had all learned that the most profound miracles often happened not through supernatural intervention, but through the simple human choice to see each other clearly, love without condition, and believe that tomorrow could be better than today. Hope closed her book and looked up at the adults who had become her extended family. "I think this is what Mama meant when she used to tell Daddy that love makes everything possible. Not magic love, but the real kind that chooses to stay, even when things get hard." Judge Sullivan nodded, understanding finally that Hope's promise had been fulfilled in ways none of them had expected. The child had indeed healed her legs, not by making them work again, but by teaching her that wholeness didn't depend on the perfect function of every part. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, her voice filled with gratitude for the impossible journey that had led them all home to each other. "Real love always keeps its promises, even when it looks different than we expected. Sometimes the greatest miracles aren't about getting back what we've lost, but discovering what we can still become." Judge Margaret Sullivan thought healing meant returning to her life before the wheelchair, but 7-year-old Hope Thompson taught her something far more profound. Wholeness doesn't require perfect bodies or perfect circumstances. For those of us who've lived through decades of change, watching our children grow up, facing health challenges, losing friends, adapting to retirement, Hope's wisdom speaks directly to our hearts. We know what it feels like when life doesn't go according to plan, when our bodies betray us, when the future looks nothing like what we imagined in our youth. But here's the truth that Hope understood instinctively. Love doesn't diminish when we can't do everything we once could. Purpose doesn't disappear when we slow down. Joy doesn't require youth. The capacity to make a difference, to touch lives, to find meaning, these gifts only deepen with age and experience. Judge Sullivan's greatest impact came not from her physical abilities, but from her opened heart. Your story isn't over. Your best chapters might still be unwritten. Sometimes healing means learning to dance in a wheelchair, finding strength in vulnerability, and discovering that our scars can become sources of wisdom and compassion. What moment in your life taught you that healing looks different than you expected? Have you ever experienced a miracle that came through human kindness rather than supernatural intervention? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.